You're overreacting, Jake. It was just sex. I stared at Lauren, struggling to process the words that had just left her mouth. She leaned casually against the kitchen counter, swirling a glass of wine like she hadn't just admitted to fucking some guy from her office. Just sex? I repeated, my voice cold. And that makes it okay? Lauren rolled her eyes. You're acting like I cheated. We agreed to this, remember? I clenched my fists. No. You agreed to it. You pressured me into this open relationship bullshit because you were bored. Oh, come on, she scoffed, setting the glass down with a sharp clink. You've been talking to girls too. Don't play the victim now. I leaned forward, bracing my hands against the counter. Yeah? How many of them did I sleep with in our bed while you were at work? That shut her up. For a second, Lauren's gaze flickered to the floor, but she recovered fast. It's not like you were home. What difference does it make? I laughed bitterly, stepping away from her. Jesus, Laudine, you're unbelievable. What do you want me to say, Jake? She snapped, crossing her arms. I told you I was going to see other people. I didn't lie about it. No, I shot back. You just conveniently left out the part where you're fucking Brian from accounting. She stiffened at that, her nails digging into her arms. Who told you that? Does it matter? Lauren's face twisted with irritation. It's none of their business. I shook my head, pacing the kitchen. You're missing the point. You didn't just sleep with some random guy. You're screwing someone we know, someone I have to see at office parties. Lauren laughed, the sound cold and dismissive. Oh, please. Grow up, Jake. This isn't high school. I stopped dead in my tracks, staring at her. Is that what you tell yourself? That I'm just being immature? She smirked, tilting her head. If the shoe fits. I stepped closer, lowering my voice. How long? Lauren's eyes narrowed slightly. Does it matter? It does to me. She held my gaze for a long moment before sighing dramatically. 6 months. 6 months. My stomach twisted. We'd only been in this open relationship for 4. I stared at her, rage bubbling just beneath the surface. So you were fucking him before we had this conversation? Lauren shrugged. I mean, yeah, but you agreed to it after. So what's the difference? The sheer audacity of her words left me speechless. She was looking at me like I was the problem, like I was the one overcomplicating things. But I wasn't angry because she slept with someone else. I was angry because she'd lied. For months. Lauren stepped around the counter, placing a hand on my chest. Her fingers traced lazily along the fabric of my shirt, but I didn't move. Jake, she purred, pressing closer. You know this doesn't change anything between us. I'm still yours. I grabbed her wrist, pulling her hand away. No, I said firmly. You're not. Her eyes darkened, a flicker of annoyance flashing across her face. Are you really going to let one little fling ruin this? She asked, voice dangerously low. I smirked, shaking my head. It's not just one, and I'm not letting anything ruin this. Lauren raised an eyebrow. Then what's your plan? Divorce me over something we agreed on? I stepped back, crossing my arms. No, Laudine, I'm not divorcing you. She relaxed slightly, but the look in my eyes made her hesitate. I'm going to make sure you regret this. Lauren laughed again, but it was more forced this time. Yeah? And how are you going to do that? She teased, but there was an edge to her voice. I smiled coldly. You'll see. Lauren's cocky grin didn't last long. I let her think I'd calmed down. I didn't mention Brian again, didn't ask any more questions. I let her believe I was rolling over like I always did. But I wasn't rolling over. I was waiting. A week passed. I barely spoke to her unless necessary. And even then, I kept it brief. She noticed. She'd toss out snide remarks, testing me. Silent treatment? Real mature, Jake. Or worse. Brian's taking me to lunch after work. Don't wait up. I didn't flinch. Didn't give her the satisfaction. But I was planning. It started with her phone. Lauren was careless. She left it unlocked on the kitchen counter one night while she showered. I wasn't even trying to snoop. At least not at first. But the screen lit up, and there it was. A text from Brian. Same time Thursday? I'll book the hotel. She replied 2 minutes later. Of course, babe. I felt the heat rise in my chest, but I kept calm. I scrolled further. There were dozens of texts. Photos. Plans. Detailed descriptions of what they were going to do the next time they met. I didn't delete them. I didn't even close the thread. I just took screenshots. Every single one. Thursday rolled around, and Lauren worked late. I followed her. It wasn't hard. She wasn't exactly discreet. I parked 2 spaces over in the hotel lot, watching from behind tinted windows as she walked inside like she owned the place. 15 minutes later, Brian showed up. Same smug look, same cocky stride. He didn't even glance around to check if anyone saw him. I let them enjoy their little rendezvous. I wasn't there to interrupt. I was there to document. Photos of them at check-in. Video of them heading upstairs. Even snapped one of them leaving the next morning. Lauren's hair a mess. Brian's hand on her lower back. They didn't notice. But they would. That weekend, I booked reservations at the same hotel. The exact same room they used. Lauren raised an eyebrow when I told her. "Wow, what's the occasion?" she asked, smirking. I shrugged. "Thought we could spice things up. Isn't that what you wanted?" She bit her lip, twirling her hair around one finger. "Trying to keep up with Brian?" I grinned. "Something like that." Lauren laughed, clearly amused. She thought she was winning. She had no idea. The room was perfect. Same bed. Same sheets. I even made sure we arrived at the same time she and Brian usually did. Lauren poured herself champagne, lounging on the bed like she didn't have a care in the world. "You're being surprisingly generous tonight," she teased. "Feeling guilty about something?" I smirked, sitting beside her. "Nah, just enjoying the view." She laughed and leaned in, kissing me lightly on the lips. Her hand slipped beneath the sheets, fingers trailing down my chest. But before things could go any further, I pulled back. "Actually," I said, grabbing my phone from the nightstand, "I thought we could watch something first." Lauren arched an eyebrow. "Oh, you're feeling adventurous." I smiled, unlocking the phone and swiping to the video folder. "Something like that." I hit play. The video filled the screen. Lauren and Brian entering this exact room, just days earlier. His hand on her ass. Her kissing his neck. Lauren froze, her body stiffening as she stared at the screen. The color drained from her face. "What the fuck is this?" she whispered. I didn't answer. I just let the video play. It went on for 4 full minutes. Lauren's breathing grew shallow, her hands gripping the sheets tightly beneath her. "Turn it off," she hissed. I didn't. Not until Brian kissed her neck on screen. Finally, I paused it. Lauren sat there, trembling, struggling to meet my eyes. "How long have you known?" she asked, her voice barely audible. "Long enough," I replied, tossing the phone onto the bed between us. She opened her mouth, but nothing came out. I leaned closer, lowering my voice. "You thought you could keep this going? Right under my nose." "It's not like that," Lauren stammered, panic flickering in her eyes. "Jake, I swear." "Don't." I cut her off, rising from the bed. "Jake, please," she pleaded, her voice cracking. I turned, grabbing my jacket from the chair. "You can stay here tonight," I said coldly. I already paid for the room. Lauren stared at me, wide-eyed, lips trembling. "But when you come home tomorrow," I added, stepping toward the door, "your shit better be gone." I left her sitting there, alone, in the same bed she shared with him. Lauren didn't come home the next day. I wasn't surprised. I half expected her to hide out at Brian's place, licking her wounds and convincing herself she could spin this into something salvageable. But by Sunday evening, her car rolled up the driveway. I was in the garage, packing up the last box of her things. She walked in quietly, dressed in that same tight red dress she always wore when she wanted to feel powerful. Her makeup was done, hair styled to perfection. She thought she could seduce her way out of this. "You didn't have to throw everything out," she said, glancing at the boxes stacked near the door. I kept my back to her, taping up the last box. "You didn't have to fuck Brian." Her smile flickered, but she kept it plastered on her face. "Jake," she sighed, stepping closer, heels clicking against the floor. "I get that you're angry, but we can move past this. People survive things like this all the time." I set the tape down with a loud snap. "Do they?" I asked, finally turning to face her. Lauren tilted her head, brushing her hair behind one ear. "We could try counseling. I'll stop seeing Brian if that's what it takes." I stared at her for a long moment, trying to figure out if she actually believed the bullshit coming out of her mouth. You really think I'm that stupid, don't you? I said calmly. Lauren's eyes narrowed. I'm trying, Jake. If you'd stop acting like a child, maybe... I laughed bitterly, cutting her off. Trying? Lauren, you've been lying to me for 6 months. The only reason you're standing here right now is because I caught you. Her face twisted into something cold. Well, maybe you should have been better in bed. I clenched my jaw, but I didn't rise to it. She wanted me to snap, to lose control. I wouldn't give her that satisfaction. Instead, I grabbed the nearest box and shoved it into her arms. Take your shit and get out. Lauren's eyes flashed with rage. You're being petty. I leaned in closer, lowering my voice. No, Loudon. Petty was sending that video to Brian's wife this morning. She froze, her entire body going stiff. What did you just say? I smirked. Oh, did I forget to mention? Brian's married. Cute family. 2 kids. Her eyes widened in horror. You didn't, she whispered. I crossed my arms, leaning casually against the wall. Sent her everything. The texts. The photos. Even the video from the hotel. Lauren's breathing grew shallow. She stumbled back, gripping the box like it might anchor her to reality. You're lying. Check his wife's Facebook, I said with a shrug. She's very vocal. Lauren fumbled for her phone, hands shaking as she scrolled through her feed. I watched her face drain of color as she found it. Brian's wife had posted a long, angry status about betrayal and how the truth always comes to light. The comments were brutal. Lauren's hand covered her mouth as she read, her eyes welling with tears. Jake, why would you do this? She choked out, looking up at me. I smiled coldly. Because you deserved it. She stared at me for a long time, tears streaming down her cheeks. For the first time since this all started, she didn't have anything to say. I opened the front door, gesturing toward the driveway. Take your stuff and go, Lauren. You've got nowhere left to hide. Lauren didn't move at first. She stood there, frozen in the doorway, clutching the box like it might somehow undo everything. But it wouldn't. Jake, you can't just kick me out, she said finally, her voice cracking. I leaned against the door frame, arms crossed. I think I just did. She set the box down with a loud thud, stepping closer, her eyes narrowing. This is our house. I laughed. Not anymore. I changed the locks this morning. The rest of your stuff is in the garage. You can grab it or leave it. I don't care. Lauren's hands curled into fists. You're being vindictive. You fucked Brian in our bed. Don't talk to me about being vindictive. Her face twisted with rage, but I saw something else there too. Fear. She didn't expect this. Lauren always thought she had the upper hand, like she could charm or manipulate her way out of anything. But not this time. I'll call a lawyer, she snapped. I smirked. Go ahead. Just make sure you mention the part where you breached the open relationship rules by screwing someone behind my back for 2 months before we agreed to it. Her eyes flickered, and I could see her brain racing to come up with something. Anything to throw back at me. Nothing came. Instead, she stormed toward the garage, heels clicking angrily against the pavement. I watched as she grabbed another box and shoved it into the trunk of her car, slamming it hard enough to make the whole thing rattle. Are you happy now? She yelled, throwing her hands in the air. I walked down the steps, leaning on the car door as she tried to shove more of her clothes into the back seat. Not yet, I said calmly. But I'm getting there. She shot me a glare sharp enough to cut glass. You're a real piece of work, Jake. I smiled, stepping back onto the porch. Takes one to know one. By the time Lauren left, the sun had started to dip below the horizon. I stood at the window, watching as her car disappeared down the street. For the first time in months, the house felt quiet. No lingering perfume. No passive-aggressive comments. Just silence. I liked it. The next morning, I was halfway through my second cup of coffee when my phone buzzed. Brian. I smiled, letting it ring twice before answering. Morning, Brian. His voice was tight, barely restrained fury bleeding through the speaker. You sent the video to my wife, Jake? What the fuck is wrong with you? I leaned back in my chair, taking a slow sip. I thought she deserved to know. You ruined my marriage, he snapped. Do you have any idea what you've done? I laughed quietly. Yeah, Brian? I do. You ruined my marriage 6 months ago. I'm just returning the favor. Silence. When he finally spoke, his voice dropped to a low growl. You're going to regret this. I grinned. I don't think I will. I hung up before he could say anything else. By the following week, Lauren was gone. She stayed with friends for a while, but word spread quickly. Brian's wife didn't just quietly divorce him. She went nuclear. Photos, texts, everything I sent her ended up plastered all over social media. Brian lost his job. Lauren did too once word got around the office. I didn't feel bad. Not even a little. Lauren showed up at the house 2 weeks later. I spotted her car creeping down the street before she finally pulled into the driveway. She sat there for a long time, hands gripping the steering wheel like she was debating whether to even get out. I didn't bother inviting her in. Instead, I opened the front door and leaned against the frame, arms crossed, waiting. Eventually, she stepped out, heels clicking against the pavement, but she wasn't as put together as usual. Her hair was a little messy, her eyes ringed with exhaustion. The confidence she used to carry like armor wasn't there anymore. What do you want, Lauren? I asked, not bothering to hide my irritation. She approached slowly, stopping at the bottom of the steps. I wanted to talk, she said, her voice softer than I expected. Can we go inside? I shook my head. No. Her jaw tightened. I didn't come here to fight, Jake. Good, I replied. Because I'm done fighting with you. Lauren's eyes flicked toward the garage, where the last of her boxes still sat waiting for pickup. You didn't have to tell Brian's wife, she muttered, staring at the ground. I laughed coldly. You didn't have to fuck Brian. She looked up sharply, glaring. You're enjoying this, aren't you? I smirked. A little. Lauren stepped closer, her voice dropping to something almost fragile. Jake, I know I screwed up, but this. She gestured to the house. We don't have to end things like this. You could have handled it differently. I narrowed my eyes. Handled it differently? You mean like letting you lie to me for another 6 months while you screwed Brian behind my back? She opened her mouth to respond, but I didn't give her the chance. You made your choice, Lauren, I said coldly. I'm just making sure you live with it. Her shoulders sagged slightly, and for a moment, I thought she might actually apologize. Instead, she straightened and crossed her arms defensively. I'll be back for the rest of my stuff this weekend, she said, turning toward the car. Fine by me, I called after her. Just make sure Brian doesn't help you load it. Lauren's glare could have cut steel, but she didn't say another word. I watched her drive off, feeling that same satisfaction settle into my chest. But that wasn't the end. Lauren couldn't just leave. She had to try one last time. A week later, I came home to find her car parked in the driveway again. This time, she wasn't alone. Brian stood beside her, arms crossed, leaning against the car with that same smug grin he always wore, like he thought he was untouchable. I took a deep breath, cracking my knuckles as I approached. Well, I said, glancing between them, this is bold. Lauren shifted nervously, but Brian just smirked. We need to talk, Brian said, his voice smooth. Man to man. I chuckled. Oh, is that what we're doing now? Didn't seem too interested in talking when you were sneaking around behind my back. Lauren stepped forward, holding up a hand. Jake, stop. Brian just wants to clear the air. I stared at Brian, watching the way his eyes flicked around the yard, avoiding direct contact. No, I said flatly. I think Brian's here to cover his ass. Brian's grin faded slightly. Look, I get it. You're pissed. But you made your point. You didn't just go after Lauren. You dragged my family into this. I took another step closer, watching him flinch. Your family, I growled. You had a wife and kids at home, and you still had the balls to fuck around with mine. Brian's eyes darkened, but I could see the cracks forming. Fine, he snapped. You want me to apologize? I am sorry, Jake. There. Happy now? I stared at him for a long moment. Then I smiled. No, Brian. I'll be happy when your wife takes every last penny in the divorce. Brian's face twisted with fury, but Lauren stepped between us, pressing her hands against his chest. Let's just go, she muttered, pushing him toward the car. Brian held my gaze for another few seconds before finally turning away, slamming the driver's door shut. Lauren paused, looking back at me. You didn't have to do this, she whispered, her eyes filled with something between regret and anger. I shrugged. You didn't have to ruin our marriage. She nodded slowly, but I could see she had nothing left to say. This time, I didn't watch her drive away. I just went inside, locked the door, and poured myself a drink. Lauren didn't come back after that. The weekend passed quietly. No texts, no calls. She didn't even pick up the last of her things. I left the boxes stacked neatly in the garage, waiting for her to grow enough backbone to face me one last time. But she never showed. On Monday, I got a call from Megan, Lauren's best friend and occasional partner in crime. I almost didn't answer, but curiosity won out. Jake, Megan started, her voice tight. I know you probably don't care, but Lauren's been staying at a hotel since Friday. She's not doing great. I leaned back in my chair, tipping it slightly. Is that supposed to make me feel bad? Megan hesitated. She's spiraling. Brian dumped her. I smirked. Of course he did. She didn't mention that when they showed up at my house together. There was a pause. Wait, Megan said, her voice sharpening. Brian was with her at your place? Yeah, he wanted to clear the air. I could practically hear Megan's eyes rolling through the phone. Jesus, what a mess, she muttered. I stayed silent, waiting for her to get to the point. After a few seconds, Megan sighed. Look, I'm not offending her, but you should know, Lauren's falling apart. She's been drinking a lot. She hasn't been to work in days. I almost laughed, but something stopped me. Is this where you asked me to take her back? Megan's voice lowered. No, I know better than that. I just thought you want to know. I pinched the bridge of my nose, closing my eyes. Thanks, Megan, but Lauren's not my problem anymore. I hung up before she could say anything else. The next time I saw Lauren, she wasn't the same woman who used to strut through the house like she owned it. It was nearly 2 weeks later, and I was dropping Ethan off at school when I spotted her car parked a few blocks away. She was sitting inside, head resting against the steering wheel, motionless. For a second, I thought she might have fallen asleep, but as I walked past, I caught a glimpse of her face through the windshield. Her eyes were red and puffy, makeup smudged along her cheeks. I stopped, halfway between pretending not to notice and knocking on her window. She looked up, locking eyes with me through the glass. I expected her to drive off. Instead, she rolled down the window slowly, her lips trembling. Jake, she whispered. I sighed. What are you doing here, Lauren? Her hands gripped the steering wheel, so tightly her knuckles turned white. I don't know, she admitted softly. I didn't know where else to go. I glanced around the street, making sure no one was watching. Don't do this, I said, lowering my voice. You need to move on. Lauren shook her head, wiping at her face with the sleeve of her jacket. I can't. I stepped closer, leaning on the edge of the car. You made your choice, Lauren. She laughed bitterly, shaking her head. Yeah, and look where it got me. For a split second, I almost felt bad for her. Almost. But then I remembered the hotel room, the texts, the smug look Brian wore when he thought he'd gotten away with it. Go home, Lauren, I said firmly, stepping back. Her eyes flickered with something. Hope, maybe. Like she thought I was offering her a second chance. But I wasn't. You don't live here anymore. Lauren's expression crumbled, but she didn't argue. She nodded slowly, rolling the window up without another word. I watched her car disappear down the street, and this time I knew she wouldn't be coming back. Later that night, Megan texted me. Megan, she told me you saw her today. I think she finally gets it. Me good. Maybe now she'll stop chasing ghosts. Megan didn't reply, and I didn't expect her to. Lauren could spiral all she wanted, but I wasn't going to be the one to catch her. Another week passed, and Lauren stayed quiet. No texts, no calls, nothing left unsaid in my driveway. It felt like she'd finally let go. But then Megan called again, and I could tell by the tone in her voice that something had shifted. Jake, I wouldn't be calling unless it was serious. I pinched the bridge of my nose. Megan, I already told you Lauren's not my problem. She got fired. That caught my attention. I sat up straight, frowning. What? She didn't show up to work for almost 2 weeks. Her boss had no choice. Megan paused. She's staying at some shitty motel outside town. I think she's out of money. I stayed silent, unsure why Megan thought I should care. She's not eating, Jake. I think she's drinking herself to sleep every night. I know you're done, but Megan trailed off, clearly struggling to find the right words. I sighed heavily. What do you expect me to do about it? I don't know. Just something. She's falling apart. That's on her, I said coldly. Megan's frustration bled through the phone. Yeah, I get it. She fucked up. But you're not like her, Jake. You're not the type to just walk away from someone who's drowning. I gripped the phone tighter, biting back the urge to hang up. Megan wasn't wrong, and that pissed me off more than anything. I drove to the motel the next morning. It wasn't far, just outside town, tucked behind a gas station. The kind of place that smelled like stale cigarettes and desperation. Lauren's car sat parked near the back, a thin layer of dust coating the windshield. I knocked on the door twice. Nothing. I knocked again, louder this time. Finally, the door creaked open. Lauren blinked at me, disheveled and half asleep, her hair tangled and dark circles carved beneath her eyes. She stared at me like she wasn't sure if I was real. What are you doing here? She asked quietly. I leaned against the doorframe. Megan called, said you're living out of this dump. Lauren gave a weak smile, though it didn't reach her eyes. I guess she can't mind her own business. I glanced past her, catching a glimpse of the room. The curtains were drawn tight, and empty bottles cluttered the nightstand. Jesus, lauding. She followed my gaze, shifting uncomfortably. It's temporary. I crossed my arms. That's what addicts say. Lauren's lips tightened, but she didn't argue. Why are you really here, Jake? I stared at her for a long moment, searching for an answer I didn't have. Finally, I exhaled. I don't know. She laughed softly, leaning against the door. At least you're honest. Silence stretched between us, heavier than I expected. Lauren's eyes softened. You can come in if you want. I shook my head. No, I'm not staying. She nodded, as if she'd expected that. I stepped back, shoving my hands into my pockets. Get your shit together, Lauren, I said, meeting her gaze. This isn't who you are. Her smile faltered, and for the first time, I saw something real, something broken beneath the surface. Maybe it is now. I left without another word. That night, I lay awake, staring at the ceiling. I thought about Lauren alone in that motel room, drowning in the mess she'd created. And for once, I didn't feel angry. I just felt tired. Lauren's downward spiral didn't stop. A week later, Megan texted again. Megan, she's still at the motel. Can you just check on her? I stared at the message for a long time before finally replying. Me? She made her bed, Megan. Megan, yeah. And now she's drinking herself into it. I threw my phone on the counter and walked away. This wasn't my fight anymore. But by the next evening, I found myself sitting in the parking lot of that same rundown motel, watching Lauren's car from across the lot. The lights in her room were off. I wasn't even sure she was inside. I didn't knock this time. I just waited. Half an hour passed before the door creaked open, and Lauren stumbled out, barefoot and wearing nothing but an oversized hoodie. A half-empty bottle dangled from her hand. She didn't see me right away. She leaned against the hood of her car, staring out at nothing, taking slow, deliberate sips from the bottle. When I finally stepped out, gravel crunching beneath my boots, her head snapped up. Her eyes were bloodshot, glazed over in that distant way that only came from drinking too much for too long. What the hell are you doing here? She slurred, squinting at me. I stopped a few feet away, crossing my arms. Megan called. Lauren laughed bitterly, tipping the bottle back again. Of course she did. Can't let me fuck up in peace, can she? I said nothing, watching as she slid down to sit on the curb. You can leave now, she muttered. I didn't move. After a long silence, Lauren exhaled sharply, running a hand through her tangled hair. Why do you care, Jake? She asked, staring down at the bottle. You won. I lost. Isn't that enough for you? I crouched down beside her, resting my arms on my knees. I don't care, I said flatly. But I'm not going to let you sit here and drink yourself to death either. Lauren looked at me, eyes narrowing slightly. Why not? I sighed. Because no matter how much I hate you, Ethan still deserves a mom who isn't a complete train wreck. She flinched at his name, and for a second the mask slipped. Tears welled in her eyes, and she quickly wiped them away with the sleeve of her hoodie. I fucked everything up, she whispered. I nodded. Yeah, you did. Lauren laughed softly, shaking her head. You're supposed to lie. Tell me it's not that bad. I didn't. Instead, I stood and offered her my hand. Come on, let's get you inside. She stared at my hand for a long moment before reluctantly taking it, letting me pull her to her feet. Her body swayed slightly, and I caught her before she could fall. You're not staying here anymore, I said firmly. Lauren's eyes widened. What? I nodded toward her car. Pack your shit. You're coming with me. She shook her head quickly, stepping back. No, Jake, I'm not asking. I interrupted. I'm not letting Ethan find out his mom drank herself to death in a motel parking lot. Her lip trembled, and for the first time, I saw something break behind her eyes. She nodded slowly. Okay, she whispered. I didn't know why I was doing it. Maybe Megan was right. Maybe I wasn't the type to leave someone drowning, no matter how much they deserved it. But I didn't do it for Lauren. I did it for Ethan. Lauren slept the entire ride back. She passed out the second I started the car, head leaning against the window, bottle forgotten on the floorboard. Her face was pale, lips parted slightly as she drifted into whatever alcohol-fueled haze she'd been living in. I should have taken her to Megan's place, but something stopped me. Maybe it was the thought of Ethan. Maybe it was the pathetic sight of her curled up in my passenger seat, like she didn't have anywhere else to go. I pulled into the driveway, cutting the engine. The house was dark. Ethan was already asleep. Lauren stirred as I opened her door. Jake, I can walk, she mumbled, trying to untangle herself in the seatbelt. I grabbed her arm as she nearly face-planted onto the pavement. Yeah, sure you can. She didn't fight me as I led her inside. Her legs barely worked, and by the time we made it to the guest room, she collapsed onto the bed like dead weight. I tossed a blanket over her and left without a word. I didn't owe her anything. The next morning, I found her sitting at the kitchen table, hair a mess and eyes bloodshot, nursing a glass of water like it was all that kept her alive. You look like hell, I said, grabbing coffee from the cabinet. Lauren smirked faintly, but there was no real humor behind it. Feel like it too. I sat across from her, sipping my coffee. She stared down at the table, tracing invisible lines on the surface. I didn't think you'd actually let me stay, she admitted softly. I shrugged. Don't get comfortable. This isn't permanent. Lauren's eyes flickered with something, regret, maybe. She nodded slowly. Thanks, she whispered. The word felt strange coming from her, like she wasn't used to saying it. Don't thank me, I replied coldly. I didn't do it for you. She flinched but didn't argue. By the time Ethan came downstairs, Lauren had already retreated to the guest room. Is Mom here? He asked, rubbing the sleep from his eyes. I nodded. Yeah, she's staying for a few days. Ethan's eyes lit up. Really? I forced a smile. Well, I wasn't going to ruin his morning. Lauren stayed out of the way. She didn't try to talk to me much, but she spent hours with Ethan, playing board games, helping with his homework, trying to piece together whatever scraps of motherhood she had left. It almost looked normal, until I remembered the motel, the drinking, the way Brian had dumped her the second his wife filed for divorce. This wasn't some heartfelt reunion. It was damage control. One evening, I found Lauren sitting on the back porch, cigarette dangling between her fingers. She wasn't smoking it, just letting it burn slowly in her hand. I stepped outside, leaning against the railing. Since when do you smoke? She laughed quietly. I don't. I just like holding it. I watched her for a long moment, the cigarette smoldering between her fingers. What's your plan, Lauren? I asked finally. She sighed, flicking ash into the grass. I don't know. Get a job. Find an apartment. Try to fix whatever this is. I raised an eyebrow. This? Lauren met my gaze, and for a brief second, I saw the woman I used to know, the one who hadn't ruined our marriage. I don't mean us, she said quickly. I know that's gone. I nodded. Good. She hesitated. But Ethan, he deserves better than you, I said bluntly. Lauren's eyes darkened, but she didn't deny it. I know, she whispered. I pushed off the railing, heading back inside. Fix yourself, Lauren, I called over my shoulder. Then we'll talk about Ethan. That night, I caught her crying in the guest room. I didn't say anything, but I left a glass of water by her bed before I went upstairs. By the end of the week, Lauren packed her things. She didn't make a big scene about leaving. No dramatic goodbye, no last-minute pleas to stay. She hugged Ethan tightly, promised she'd see him soon, and slipped out the front door without saying much to me at all. I watched from the window as her car pulled out of the driveway, headlights disappearing down the street. Ethan sat on the couch, watching cartoons, oblivious to the storm that had just passed. I envied him for that. 3 days later, Megan called. She found an apartment, Megan said, sounding surprised. It's small, but it's something. I grunted in response, not particularly interested in Lauren's new living situation. She also got a job, Megan added. That caught me off guard. Where? Some local diner near downtown. Waitressing. I smirked. Lauren hadn't worked a service job since college. The idea of her balancing trays and dealing with rude customers almost made me laugh. Guess she's finally getting a taste of humble pie, I muttered. Megan chuckled softly. Yeah, she's trying, Jake. I know it doesn't mean much, but she is. I didn't reply. A week passed before Lauren texted. Lauren, can I see Ethan this weekend? I stared at the message, thumb hovering over the keyboard. Me. Pick him up at 10. She didn't respond, but I knew she'd be there. Saturday morning, Lauren stood at the door, wearing jeans and a plain t-shirt. No makeup, no expensive perfume. Ethan ran up to her immediately, hugging her legs with a wide grin. She knelt down, brushing his hair back and smiling like she hadn't almost lost him forever. Ready, kiddo? She asked softly. Ethan nodded excitedly, grabbing his backpack. Lauren glanced up at me. I'll have him back by 6. I nodded. Don't be late. She smiled faintly. I won't. As they walked to the car, Ethan chattered endlessly about school, soccer, and his new favorite video game. Lauren listened, laughing at all the right moments, but I could see it, the quiet guilt in her eyes, the weight she still carried. She knew she was lucky to even be standing there, and I planned to keep it that way. I closed the door and locked it behind me, feeling the weight of everything slowly start to lift. Lauren wasn't forgiven, not by a long shot, but at least she was someone else's problem now. Thank you for listening the story to the end. Write in the comments what do you think about the story and subscribe for more.